Good evening, class, and I'm back after a short break that we took from the classes. And today, we will be discussing the last topic for obligations before we move to contracts. So, today we will be discussing what is called modes of extinguishing obligations. Okay, so here we will be discussing how an obligation ends or how an obligation is terminated. Based on this part of the discussion sa obligations and contracts, there are six modes of extinguishing obligations. But as we will learn later, hindi lang ito yung mga modes of extinguishing obligations na makikita sa civil code. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So, under the law on obligations and contracts, there are six modes of extinguishing obligations. First, we have payment or performance, loss of the thing due, condonation or remission of the debt, confusion or merger of the rights of creditor and debtor, compensation, novation, and others. Okay. Dito meron tayong anim na paraan para ma-extinguish ang isang obligation. Kumbaga, how does an obligation end? Well, you pay it, if it's lost, mga ganyan. But as you can see in the last part, meron diyang others. Sometimes meron tayong tinatawag na prescription, death, etc. But that will be discussed in a separate lecture. Okay. So, for this lecture, we will be focusing more on the six enumerated modes of extinguishing obligations under the law on obligations and contracts. So, simulan natin sa payment or performance. Okay. Here, payment or performance is defined as delivery of money or performance of an obligation, voluntary or not. Okay. So let's try to dissect that definition. Okay. Delivery of money. Usually kapag sinasabi natin payment, we are referring to money, pera. Pero it can also be performance, or if you have an obligation and it's not really an obligation to give money, it is called performance. Now, important itong part ng voluntary or not, because it is important for us to distinguish whether, it is important for us to know na payment is not only something that is voluntarily made, pero minsan involuntary siya. Like for example, it is mandated by court. Kumbaga, yung court na yung nagsabi na kailangan bayaran mo yung isang tao, or worse, yung court na mismo ang mag-execute nung mag-execute nung mga properties. Kumbaga, kukunin ng court yung properties through the sheriff, ganyan, i-auction sale, tapos mambabayad dun sa taong pinagkautangan. So, it's important that to know na yung payment na tinutukoy natin dito or performance could be voluntary or not. Okay. As a rule, the payment should be complete. The payment or the performance should be complete. Kailangan buo yung performance. Hindi pwedeng partial. Gaya nga nang na-discuss natin last time. Gaya nang na sabi ko last time. Okay. The law itself is saying that already. Hindi siya sabi ng batas na kailangan kompleto yung performance. Unless of course na pag-usapan nyo, that's one exception. Another exemption is yung tinatawag natin na substantial compliance. Kumbaga, in substantial compliance, na-deliver naman niya ng buo, meron lang isang minor na meron lang isang a small proportion of the entire obligation na hindi na fulfill. For example, ang usapan is catering business, ganyan, magki-cater sa isang kasal, pero well, everything was provided except sabi dun sa package meron dapat wine pero wala, well, that is substantial compliance already. Okay? So, kahit na hindi nila na-perform ng buo yung obligation, considered na parang as a consideration doon sa tao, parang i-consider na rin siya as complete. Substantial kasi yung compliance. Kumbaga na-comply naman niya, meron lang ilang snags or meron lang konting kulang. So that is already enough. Kahit na hindi siya complete yung performance, it's already enough to extinguish the obligation ng isang tao. Kung titignan natin, for example, umutang sa'yo ng 1,000, may interest na, for example, 120 pesos, pero nabayaran niya yung principal plus yung interest, kulang lang ng 5 piso or kulang ng piso yung bayad niya. In a sense, that could be considered as substantial compliance already doon sa utang. And then the obligation can be extinguished. Kumbaga, mawala na yung obligation niya kahit na kulang ng ilang barya or whatever. Okay. Or kahit na hindi complete yung performance, pwede rin na ma-extinguish na yung obligation if the creditor accepted the performance or accepted the payment kahit kulang without objection. Kumbaga, what do you call this? Tinanggap niya yung pag-comply ng isang tao doon sa obligation niya kahit alam niyang kulang at hindi siya nag-object. Well, it operates to extinguish the obligation. Kumbaga, it doesn't matter if it's incomplete kasi tinanggap mo yan without any objections, without any reservations whatsoever. Yan tinatawag natin na principle of estoppel. Kung the estoppel is a generic law term, pero in this case, for example, kung tinanggap mo siya, hindi ka nag-object, kumbaga you lose the right to claim yung remaining. Okay? So yeah. That is estoppel. So again, the rule is dapat buo yung performance, pero there are instances kahit na hindi buo yung performance, mako-consider pa rin na ma-extinguish yung obligation if there is substantial compliance and there is acceptance despite incompleteness without objection. In payment, it matters kung sino ang magbabayad or kung sino ang perform ng obligation. Here we will discuss sinong maaaring magbayad, who may pay. Of course, first and foremost, syempre kung sino yung may obligation, kung sino yung nag-constitute ng obligation, generally siya yung magbabayad, which is the debtor. Or in some instances where it's not possible for the debtor to pay for himself, pwede siyang mag-appoint ng representatives or the law can allow yung kanyang mga representatives to pay or perform the obligation. Kumbaga, for example, yung kanyang successors in interest, yung mga interested parties which will be discussed later, or yung heirs niya in case he or she died, or yung estate, mga ganyan. These are the entities or people who can pay for yung the obligation for it to be extinguished. Also, it could be third persons it could be a third person who has an interest in the fulfillment of the obligation. Kumbaga, if one person o yung isang tao kumbaga interesado siya na matapos nung tao yung obligation niya because maybe it will benefit him or her in the long run, pwedeng siya ang magbayad in behalf of yung debtor. So that way, kung ano man yung interest na meron siya doon sa obligation or yung sa fulfillment ng obligation, well, makukuha niya na. Okay? So this is This is basic. So, generally, the person who shall pay is the debtor himself or herself o yung kanyang legal representatives, but it could also be yung third persons who have an interest in the fulfillment of the obligation. Okay? As a general rule, hindi ni-recognize ng batas yung right ng third persons who have no interest whatsoever doon sa performance. Kumbaga, yung creditor cannot be required to accept yung payment if it's not from a person who has interest doon sa fulfillment ng obligation.